Good evening, everyone, and welcome to another episode of Triple Threat Comics YouTube channel. I'm your host, Ian Miller. Tonight, I welcome a very talented author and a comic book writer as well. Please welcome Will Murray. Well, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Ian. It's a pleasure to be here. I've talked to you for the last 15 minutes, and it's been very interesting.
Well, I aim to please.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. I'm very excited to have you on here because I've actually followed your career to some extent, from your writing. But why don't you tell the audience how you got into writing?
Like a lot of people in the comic world, or in the old days, in the science fiction world, through fanzines, writing for fanzines, and making a little bit of a reputation, and slowly, your name gets out there, slowly transitioning to, professional work. So I was first published in a Doc Savage fanzine in the 70s, mimeographed, so it's, back in those days, that's all you could get. And worked my way up to, bigger and better things. And I think I had two big breaks, several big breaks. One is that I got permission to write a Doc Savage novel from one of Lester Dent's unused outlines. And while it took 11 years to get into print, it did get into print. I ghostwrote the Destroyer paperback series that became a movie, Remo Williams' The Adventure Begins, and I wrote more than 40 of those books. And another big break is a friend of mine, long distance friend, ended up editor of Starlog magazine and started throwing assignments my way. And I started going on movie sets, covering films, and also writing for Comic Scene and Fangoria and their related magazines. So my career kind of snowballed from fairly modest beginnings, but they're all like in the world of fans, popular culture, comics, movies, TV, etc., etc. And it's still very active in even though Starlog is gone. I write for Retrofan. I do a regular column on nostalgia things, old TV shows, who created Archie Andrews, who created Mighty Mouse, things like that. And so I keep my hand very strongly into the fiction and the nonfiction fields.
That's fantastic.
It is, actually.
Yeah, and you've covered a lot, and you also co-created another character, as I recall.
Squirrel Girl. This is a you see it. It's a sweater my sister got me for Christmas a year or so ago. So when I go to Christmas conventions, I can be Squirrel Girl. Yeah, I created the character based on an old girlfriend who was into animal rescue, specifically squirrels, and she was knocking around in my head for several years. I mentioned her as a joke in some of my Destroyer novels, and then one day when I was working for Marvel Comics, they wanted me to do a fill-in issue of Iron Man, and I thought, well, who would be a good villain for Iron Man? Dr. Doom. Okay, but what can we do that would make this more than just another issue? Well, I'll introduce Squirrel Girl. And Tom Morgan was supposed to be the artist, but the day they were handing him the script, Steve Ditko walked into the office looking for work, and they gave it to him instead. And that's how Steve Ditko became the co-creator of Squirrel Girl. He was not originally going to be the artist.
Oh boy, things happen.
Things happen.
That's still amazing. I heard that story once when I had a couple of Marvel guys come on the show, but it's still exciting to hear from you specifically how that happened.
Well, the key experience that caused the name Squirrel Girl to come into existence was I went to church with my girlfriend at the time. This is the 1980s, and her first name was Doreen, just like Squirrel Girl. And it was winter. She was wearing a winter jacket. In the middle of the mass, she pulls down the zipper of her jacket, and a little baby squirrel head pops out. She had found a rescued baby squirrel and was carrying it around, keeping it warm. I had no idea it was there. And, I told that story. And I don't know if it was me or someone else who started calling her Squirrel Girl. And so it kind of evolved from just the name and the concept of the character. Her personality is a lot like the original Squirrel Girl that I wrote. you know, kind of young and idealistic and positive.
Yeah, I like that. Something we need.
Yeah.
Okay, so this evening we're talking about the main topic is a book that you had just finished called Night of Darkness: The Legend of the Shadow.
And that is my third book on the shadow in the last few years. Let me flash the cover. Cover is by Joe DeVito. It shows the shadow in his sanctum broadcasting through the radio station. He used to broadcast in the early 30s. And it has a back cover by Mike Kaluta, who became famous for doing the shadow at DC Comics. And for the hardcover edition, he gave us a different back cover. And of course, I'm holding it wrong. And I love this image. The shadow is a puppet master. I don't know if I can get this in quite as strongly. And this is a collection of articles on the shadow and interviews, and and the history of the shadow, and told in those articles. Like I said, it's a third book I've done. In this one, because I've done two previous ones that focused on the pulp magazine version of the shadow and the radio incarnation, I wanted to broaden this topic because we can't repeat ourselves endlessly. I'd written, and many of these are reprinted from my long career writing for various magazines. But we get into Walter Gibson, the creator of the Shadow, his comic book career. He had a big comic book career, writing the Shadow in comics, Blackstone, the Magician, and Batman for a brief time, and other characters. But also the Shadow in comics. We focus on the DC Shadow. We focus on the Archie comic Shadow, where he was a superhero, which I bought as a kid, where he was just this ridiculous character. And there are two great interviews, long interviews at Walter Gibson. One talking about the breadth of his career in the Shadow, but the other talking about the media adaptations of the Shadow. That was the last interview I did with him before he passed away in '85. So that's 40 years ago. Amazing. And in my Starlog days, I spent 2 weeks in the set of the Shadow movie when they were filming that, in Universal Studios. And I had done a long interview with David Koepp, the screenwriter of the Shadow movie. And so I dug out that tape and created a new article. So we get into the movie, and I also talk about the Shadow TV pilot that never aired from the 1950s. Koepp was funny because I talked to the producer, I talked to the director, and they all gave me conflicting answers as to whether that movie was based on the radio show or the pulp magazine. And they were very definitive. But of course, Koepp, clearly took from both in a fairly intelligent way. The movie may have disappointed many, but it was at least a strong attempt to do the character properly.
Yeah, I always loved that movie. I loved what David Koepp did with the script and the character, and it could not have been easy to borrow from the pulp and the radio show, to mix it in all together.
Well, they also borrowed from the Howard Chaykin comic book, where the Shadow was kind of a bad guy at the beginning, and I think that was a mistake, because they made him evil who learned, to be good. And that was not the Shadow. The Shadow pretended to be evil in order to fight crime. He's like Batman, only Batman came later. Why does Batman dress like a giant bat? To appear more frightening and terrifying to ordinary crooks than a cop or a detective or an FBI man. So the other thing about that movie, I always remember this. I watched them shoot for 2 weeks, and what I noticed is many of the scenes they would shoot three ways: serious, comedic, and somewhere in the middle. Okay, which I think was another mistake. Now, what they're doing is they're covering their butts, because they got to see how a movie isn't a movie till they cut it. Okay, till they cut the footage and throw away the other footage. It's not a movie; it's just footage. So it could be anything. They have turned love stories into detective stories and detective stories into love stories by selectively editing. Well, this movie was all over the place in terms of its tone. It started very serious, very moody. The opening was great. Then it kind of roller coastered. It's funny. It's not funny. It's dramatic. It's goofy. It's whatever. And I watched them shoot the scene where they're chasing the beryllium sphere around a room. And they, like I said, they shot it 3 different ways. And one way was super over the top, comedic. And I don't think a movie that starts mysterious should get that comedic. It should stay within some range. You can have humor, but you can't violate the tone that you set up. And they did that. And that was, I think, partly why that movie didn't work out as well.
If well, like you said, they were covering the bases and also possibly trying to appease the studio execs because they're pretty sure they're looking at the footage going, okay, we need a lighter tone in here
Yeah,
because we
no,
might
no.
alienate the
A lot
audience.
of heads go into the editing of the film, and not necessarily the director. Sometimes he's got input, sometimes he doesn't. So
Yeah,
sometimes the editor is at the mercy of the guy who cuts the film.
it happens. But yeah, as I was reading the book, I was starting to read some of the interviews that you had with Gibson specifically,
Mm-hmm.
especially the first one where you had written that he had had a heart attack the year before,
Mm-hmm.
but he came to this convention, his mind was sharp, and he
Mm-hmm.
came back from it. He was able to have what I think it must have been, well, again, you remember this better than I would because I wasn't there, a 30-minute conversation about the making of the Shadow.
It's probably 60 minutes. We did it on videotape. I don't have the videotape, but we did it on videotape with the idea that we would splice in my face, you know, when I asked the questions, and we never got around to doing that. So it's just a headshot or a body shot of Walter just telling it. And I wish I had that videotape because it's a rare record of him talking about his career in detail. Because I very carefully picked the questions so that we did a tour of his career. So it was all in one kind of 60-minute, excursion through his career.
That must have been something just to have a person who've read his writing for a number of years just to be in front of you all of a sudden and asking these questions.
Well, I'd known Walter at that point probably close to 10 years. I first met him in a New York City convention, interviewed him there, and we developed a telephone friendship. And he was always willing to answer questions. And, he recognized that maybe among the people who were into the shadow, maybe I was a little sharper, a little more perceptive, and a little more professional. Uh, but he told me many stories, answered many questions, and I wish I'd asked some that I didn't think to ask when he was alive. You know,
Mhm.
uh, and he was an amazing guy. He multi-talented, and he was for the 40s. He was a really good comic script writer as well as newspaper script writer. And big friend and confidant of many major magicians of the 20th century, and very knowledgeable in other areas. He had a tremendous memory. Rarely caught him, misremembering something.
Man, again, this is fantastic. Yeah, because again, I only know him obviously from his writing, but it's great to actually talk to someone who actually met him and was friends with him.
Yeah, he was down to earth, and he didn't show a lot of ego. I mean, he was proud of his many accomplishments, but also he was, he said he would say things like, if I had put some of the money I made on the shadow into real estate, I'd be a millionaire now. But he was too busy writing to do that kind of business work, and he was well traveled. He wrote many nonfiction books after The Shadow and before. And in the world of the professional magicians, which includes Houdini, Thurston, Dunninger, all these famous people who are half forgotten now, he was considered on their level as a person who was knowledgeable about magic. I mean, he did a little performing, but he wasn't a super professional. But he invented tricks they used. He suggested tricks they used, and so he was a confidant, and he had their confidence in terms of he was part of that inner circle of the professional magician when they were at their peak in the early 20th century. I mean,
Again,
most people are lucky to be
yeah,
recognized in one field. He's recognized in multiple fields. The Shadow became a major radio character. That all came from him, ultimately. And the character predated his first Shadow novel as an announcer, but didn't become a personality. Lamont Cranston was his idea. The Shadow as a crime fighter was his idea. The Shadow could have been a magician. He could have been a bad guy. He could have been, the personification of fate. He could have been like Dracula, you know. He was a very good writer on his level. He wrote in that thriller style that was popular in that era that he lived and worked in. But he didn't write on the modern level that a Dashiell Hammett or a Lester Dent or a Raymond Chandler wrote. He wrote on what he considered to be a solid professional thriller level, like Sax Rohmer, the guy who created Fu Manchu. He wrote on that level, which meant plot was everything, narrative was strong, dialogue was essentially serviced the plot. The other guys would put more personality into their characters. He just stuck to the story.
a lot of ways that actually was beneficial to him because again, the stories kept getting bigger and also better, and people were more invested.
And he had to write 2 a month for what was it, from 32 to 42. So that's 10 years. 2 a
Yeah,
month is a killer. That's probably 400 pages of typewritten pages a month. Okay,
yeah,
so that's 50 pages a week, not counting the outlines he had to write and get approved before he wrote a book. So that's a lot, but he was able to do it.
yeah. So in the Night of Darkness, obviously, it covers pretty much everything the Shadow, from radio to the films to obviously the pulp magazines and a couple of novels.
What about the novels?
It covers also some of a couple of the novels.
Yeah, because the Shadow was such a strong pulp fiction character. I'll tell you a funny story. With this book, I wanted to collect almost all of the Shadow articles and interviews I'd done over the past 50 years. And we laid out the text, my designer did, Matt Mooring, and it was 600 pages long. And I said, oh my God, that's too big. So we had to put it aside and figure out what to do. I'd been talking to Jim Steranko about using some of his art and doing a shadow gallery in the book and maybe an interview with Steranko. And when the book ended up 600 pages, I realized I'm going to have to cut this book to the bone, save this stuff for another book if there is another book. So the Steranko thing went out the window, unfortunately, and some other thing I was trying to do, an art thing, went out the window. So I'm looking at all this text, and I had a lot of art, but not enough art. And I reached out to Mike Kaluta to use an unpublished or not unpublished Shadow DC cover, but a cover that was used and rejected, and it appeared in fanzines. And I said, I'd like to use this as a black and white image. And he said, sure. And I forget exactly how this happened, but one night, I remember I was in New Orleans visiting someone, and all of a sudden on my iPad, I'm getting these downloads of dozens of black and white images of the Shadow saying, use whatever you want. No bill, no charge. And I asked him, don't you want to be paid for this? No, you're one of the good guys. And I only met him once. I met him at a New York convention, probably in the 80s. So we were Facebook friends, but, we didn't interact particularly. We knew each other, obviously. And he knew I was a Shadow champion. So he did me the great good favor of letting me use a ton of art. So this thing has like 50 black and white illustrations, as well as the wonderful color covers, color back covers. And some of this art was previously unpublished. And a number of them, since I talked about the Batman Shadow connection, as you probably know, or maybe you don't, the first Batman story in Detective was at 27, was a compressed version of a Shadow novel by Theodore Tinsley, one of the Shadow supplemental writers.
Yeah.
And it's just a naked stealing of the storyline with the names changed and Batman replacing the Shadow. And the interesting thing is, the Shadow is shown in a death trap in one of the illustrations in the magazine, and Kane basically copied that illustration. So Bill Finger, the writer, and Bob Kane, the artist, basically stole for the first Batman story a Shadow storyline, just stole it, and made only the changes necessary to fit 8 pages or whatever the number of pages was. So there's several articles in here about the Batman Shadow connection, and Kaluta had done a number of illustrations, just sketches of Batman and the Shadow, hanging out together. So I included all of those because it's like, this is great. It fits because Walter Gibson wrote Batman briefly, and the Shadow met, Batman in DC Comics back in the 70s. So the connection was pretty strong. But I can't thank Mike Kaluta enough because he solved my illustration problem and didn't break the bank as far as my budget is concerned.
Well, it's a great addition to the book because, again, you get some of his caliber who had done the Shadow for the comics for a number of years, and suddenly it's in the book about the Shadow. It really does help, if, fans of his to come to you. But then again, they're already fans of yours, all right?
Mm-hmm.
They know who you are. They know what you've done for the Shadow, Doc Savage, and these other characters. So they're going to come anyway. This is just an added bonus.
Yeah. No, absolutely. Well, when I do these books, I always want to give the buyer, the customer, the reader, as much extra material as I can. If that's extra art, it's extra art. If it's something else, it's something else. I did a Tarzan meets John Carter of Mars novel, and for the hardcover, I had a Tarzan meets Sherlock Holmes story that was authorized by both the Burroughs estate and the Conan Doyle estate. That's a bonus. I didn't have to put that in there, but I got the idea for the story, got the permissions, and I said, okay, you're buying the hardcover, here's something that you can't get anywhere else. And when I do the Spider, which is a popular pulp character of back in the 30s, sort of the super violent version of the Shadow, in the back of all those hardcovers, I use some of the other characters from that publisher, Popular Publications, who doesn't exist anymore, but the licensor owns all those characters. And I have crossovers. I do a lot of crossover books. I had King Kong meet Tarzan in a book called King Kong versus Tarzan. I had King Kong meet Doc Savage in a Doc Savage Skull Island book. I had Doc Savage meet the Shadow in 2 books. And I become the king of crossovers. Tarzan met John Carter of Mars in 2 books I've done so far, and you might meet him again in a future book. And like I said, all my spiders are crossovers. And it all came up by accident, just the luck of properties falling into my lap. And said, wait a minute, we can do a crossover here, So I've been very fortunate because I love all these old pulp and movie characters. I should show you, because I'm talking about Kaluta, this is the cover of the first of my Shadow books that I've done recently.
Ooh.
Dark Avenger, The Strange Saga of the Shadow. Joe DeVito is the cover artist. And I love how the New York skyline turns into the Chinatown skyline down here. It's got an auto gyro. This is actually the second, Dark Avenger. This is the first, Master of Mystery, The Rise of the Shadow. Again, a Joe DeVito cover. We also had the Chinatown theme. It was a big theme in the Shadow novels, so we put it in on this cover. And so I've now done 3 books on the Shadow. Dark Avenger is actually a book. It's a history of the Shadow in pulps and radio. The other are collections of articles, interviews that I've written over the years. And it kind of shocks me I've written so many Shadow articles, but I have. So there it is.
Well, it just shows that you love for the character.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think it's fair to say because of your work on the Shadow, your books, and also keep making sure that the Shadow still is, in people's minds.
Well, I think that's
is part of
important.
that.
He was an enormously important pulp magazine and radio character, much imitated, both in pulps and on radio. And the Pulps, the Spider, the Black Bat, and several other characters were imitations of the Shadow. There were a lot of pulp characters who had black cloaks, floppy hats, two guns. That was all off the Shadow. On radio, Tales of the Mysterious Traveler, the Man in Black, the Whistler, a number of others. They were all narrators, which is what the Shadow was originally, the narrator of different stories. Then he became a character when they decided to adapt the pulp magazine stories, loosely, but they did adapt them.
Yeah, as I recall, they actually added some stuff from the radio show into the pulp stories, particularly Margot Lane, because obviously she was never in the pulp
in
magazines.
The pulps, yeah. What they seem to have done is with the Shadow in the beginning. We're talking about in the beginning of the Shadow as a character. They basically, Lamont Cranston and Margot Lane were basically Nick and Nora Charles from The Thin Man, which is a very popular Dashiell Hammett movie. And they started that way, a little more dark than it was, later. When Orson Welles was a Shadow, the stories were much more fantastic. The Shadow had telepathic abilities as well as the clouding man's mind abilities. And they backed away from that more mysterioso Shadow, and they went super Nick and Nora Charles and just went for the lighter touch, but they kept the mystery and the sinister stuff. They just didn't get into the science fiction kind of things they were doing with Wells.
Yeah, especially shortly after maybe 39, 40. Yeah, they started moving away from those type of stories because, again, the Nick and Nora, type of storytelling took over.
Yeah. I think they wanted to be a little more listener friendly. Because Wells, the scripts that Wells did, I don't know who wrote them, but they were pretty intense, and they were somewhat violent, and they skirted with science fiction and occult elements, which later ones didn't so much. It was really toned down, and so they kind of made Lamont Margot more the front persons in the Shadow. He would come in at key points, and then you wouldn't hear from him again. So it was really Lamont and Margot show with the Shadow, popping in as needed. And that's how they made it, family friendly.
Yeah. Yeah. Orson's laugh scared me, especially with that. Then there was Joel Stone. His laugh was really terrifying because, especially when he went into the lower register of his voice, you're like, wow.
Well, the truth is, if you're talking about the voice in the beginning of the Orson Welles episodes, that's not Welles. That's
I know.
Frank Riddick, who was the original Shadow, who worked. There was one before him who didn't quite work. And Riddick's Shadow was very intense and really made people really shiver back in the early 30s when radio was new and people were a little less sophisticated. People would have nightmares from the Shadow just from that laugh.
But I think the laugh should be terrifying because, again, you're terrifying into the hearts of criminals.
Yeah, no, yeah. Well, it's just the Batman thing. Why does Batman dress like a bat? To terrify criminals.
Exactly.
Why does the Shadow laugh? To intimidate. He uses the laugh as much of a weapon as the 45 automatics that he employed. I mean, the whole idea was to have the advantage over criminals, who usually were the ones who had the advantage over their victims.
Yeah. Okay. There's another thing that you had written. Let's talk about that for a minute. It's the Wild Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Now, this is a collection of short stories that you did on Holmes and Watson and new mysteries.
Yeah, what happened is very interesting. Is I read a few Holmes stories as a kid, and then didn't read the whole canon for many years later. I was asked to contribute a Holmes story to an anthology that was crossovers, and I teamed up Holmes with a real life character, Richard Henry Savage, who was the inspiration for Doc Savage. He was a soldier of fortune, etc., etc. I did that story, and I thought it worked out well, and I really wanted to do a pure Holmes story. And then few years later, someone asked me to do contribute a Sherlock Holmes story to another anthology, but it was also a crossover. So I had him encounter Dr. Herbert West from H.P. Lovecraft.
Oh.
And a few years after that, David Markham, who's doing the MX anthology hardcover Sherlock Holmes collections, reached out and said, would you be interested in doing a Sherlock Holmes story? So I did one. It was my first pure Sherlock Holmes story. I thought, well, I achieved that. That was fine. A few months later, he asked for another and another. And after a while, it started to snowball. I was getting into it. So he also did anthologies for other publishers, and they would reach out to me. And that was probably around 2017, give or take, in here 2025. I've written, and I'm writing now what I think is like my 55th, 56th, 57th Sherlock Holmes story.
Wow.
And it's like sometimes I go for months without writing one, and then I get an idea, and sometimes I'll just write the opening and just put it aside and come back to it. And sometimes I'll write it in a day and spend a week polishing it. And it kind of baffles me because I wasn't so huge a Sherlock Holmes fan. When I started reading them all, I really liked them. I read them all in order for preparation to write some of these stories. And I was sorry when I ran out of them, as everybody is who likes Holmes. But, 55 or whatever it is, Sherlock Holmes stories is a hell of a lot.
Yeah.
And mine are mostly traditional purist stories set in the original time period. But because some of the anthologies want the supernatural or a crossover, I have crossovers. And I did two novelette, one short story and one novelette, where there's a second War of the Worlds. The invaders come back, and Sherlock Holmes and his brother and Watson have to deal with it. And that was fun. But that was over the top. That was not something Conan Doyle would have done. But, I have the latitude now to do that because, everybody else is doing crazy stuff. I'll do stuff that isn't so crazy. So I've become a kind of a major Sherlock Holmes guy, and it's much to my surprise, but he's a wonderful character. And there's a lot of research you can do and get ideas from. You can just read old stuff from the Victorian times. Oh, that's an idea. I'll use that, So I've done I've collected my stories into 5 volumes, and slowly but steadily I'm moving towards the 6th volume. And I think I mentioned that we did Tarzan meets Tarzan of the Apes, but in his Lord Greystoke persona in London. So it isn't Sherlock Holmes going to the jungle, because that would be kind of a weird story. Yeah. But so we got the authorization from both the Burroughs estate and the Conan Doyle estate, which is quite a feather in my cap, since they don't authorize Sherlock Holmes stories these days, but they authorized mine.
Hey, respect.
Yeah. Maybe I'll do another.
Maybe.
You never know.
Yeah. As it is, I had to buy some of these volumes myself because, again, these are very fascinating topics and stuff that I'm very much into. So I had to thank you for that.
You're welcome.
So I know we talked about this earlier before the show started. You actually have a short story in the Thrilling Adventure Yarns 2026 campaign.
Yeah, I've been contributing to those volumes. I think I only missed one of them. And for this one, they wanted more sword and sorcery stories. That was what readers were saying. And I'd never written a sword and sorcery story. So I came up with an idea. I pitched it to them. They said, fine. It's called The Silver Snail. And it's about this, what might be a barbarian or a warrior, coming down out of the mountains to this city-state in some never land that I invented. And, the guardians of the city said, well, we don't allow strangers here unless they pass a test, and you got to go into the maze. And the maze is the Silver Snail, and it looks like a great silver dome, and you go in it, and you have to navigate the maze. And there are 3 exits, but only one is real, 3 exit doors. If you pick the wrong one, the real one locks. Oh. And so there's only one way out, and he's got to figure out how to pick the right door and get out of the maze and survive. So I came up with a gimmick for him that I'm not going to say, but he's not exactly what he seems to be.
Fascinating. I like that.
Thank you.
Again, I have to definitely get that book now.
Yeah, I mean, my fingers are crossed. The Kickstarter reaches at least its initial goal. I sold them, or I gave them a Lester Dent unpublished story for inclusion if it reaches the higher goals. I don't know that it will or it won't, but they've been running Lester Dent stories in unpublished Lester Dent stories in several of the thrilling adventure yarns because I'm the literary agent for the Lester Dent estate. So I've been doing that since '79.
That's right. I recall this now because I saw that you actually adapted one of those stories, or at least the outline, into a radio drama for National Public Radio in
Yeah,
'85, I believe.
I adapted the Thousand Headed Man, one of the top popular Doc Savage novels of the early days, and I did that back in the '80s, and it turned out well. And the producer adapted Fear Key, which is another early Doc Savage novel. Unfortunately, we never did a second season. I would love to have done that.
Hmm. It happens, but considering this is the age of podcasts,
Well, you never know. Well, rights are an issue. You have to clear the
yeah,
rights.
yeah,
And not always easy.
no,
I have managed to write 22 Doc Savage novels, most based on Lester Dent's unfinished outlines and starts and all that stuff, and one Patricia Savage novel that's his cousin. So that's 23 books, but right now I can't get the rights to do any more.
eh, c'est la vie.
But still, I had Doc meet King Kong and Doc meet the Shadow twice and fight Shaywan Khan once, so I'm pretty happy about that.
As you should be, because again, those are hell of crossovers.
Yeah. These are crossovers that previously had been dreamed about, but nobody could quite swing the rights. And some of the rights are very tangled. I mean, with Doc and the Shadow, it was a matter of someone having the right to do a Doc novel and the Shadow rights being available. With Tarzan and King Kong, those are two separate, intellectual properties. And the King Kong rights were so convoluted. It was people have tried to do Tarzan meets King Kong before and couldn't navigate the rights. I just lucked out thanks to my cover artist Joe DeVito, who was connected to the estate of I was going to say Carl Denham, but no, Willis. I don't want to say Willis O'Brien, but it's not him either. I'm blanking right now, but the guy who created King Kong.
Edgar Wallace?
No, he was the guy who wrote
the
screenplay.
Oh, it was Cooper. It was Cooper. What was
it? Yeah, Cooper. Yeah, Marion C. Cooper. Yeah,
that's right.
So many people are key to King Kong. It's easy you don't want to forget Willis O'Brien, who did the stop motion animation, or Edgar Wallace, who came up with the original. I think it was the treatment, not the screenplay.
Yeah, it was.
And Carl Denham, of course, was the character. So but I've been very fortunate. People love to see Tarzan meets John Carter, but nobody's writing Tarzan novels over the last 25 or so years. And people who tried to have Tarzan meets John Carter in book form weren't able to pull it off. They were able to do it in comics, but not in novel form. And I was able to pull it off. And Doc Savage meets King Kong was like perfect because Doc Savage magazine started basically when King Kong was first hitting the theaters. And of course, Doc's headquarters was the Empire State Building, and King Kong, climbed the Empire State Building in his last reel. So, they did have this weird connection in time and in space, in place. So I was very lucky. That was my first crossover, Tarzan. Doc Savage meets King Kong, which is called Skull Island, but a lot of it takes place in Skull Island. So the book starts after Kong has fallen off Doc Savage headquarters. Then Doc tells the story in flashback how he met King Kong 10 years before, 20 years before on Skull Island.
That's very clever.
Yeah, because you can't really have you can't put Doc Savage in the King Kong story. We know it just doesn't fit. You can't accomplish anything. We know how it ends. It's a
Yeah.
mistake people made putting Sherlock Holmes in the first War of the Worlds. I mean, you can slide him in there. The time period's right. The location is correct. But we know how War of the Worlds is going to end. Sherlock Holmes can't do anything except sniff around and have encounters and watch how the Martians succumb to the germs in the Earth's atmosphere like everybody else. He doesn't. So when I did Sherlock Holmes in the War of the Worlds, it was like there's a second invasion. So it's a whole different ball game, and he's got to solve this problem, which he does.
Well, again, he's Sherlock Holmes.
Yeah.
Well, it has been a treat to have you on here and talk to you about your work and your career and these wonderful books.
Well, thank you. I should give my website. The Wild Adventures books are all on www.adventuresinbronze.com, which is my website. You can get the hardcovers and the softcovers there. My softcovers are also on Amazon. Oh, there we go. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's my most recent Sherlock Holmes in the brown cover. That's Night of Darkness. My Wild Adventures of Cthulhu book, the most recent one, is there. 2 recent Spider novels, and my Back to Mars book with the Sherlock Holmes Tarzan crossover at the back is there. And more. That's my first Sherlock Holmes. My first Tarzan goes to Barsoom. None of my Doc Savages are on the front page because they're not recent. But if you click on series in the upper, up there, you'll start to see my Doc Savage covers. All of which are by Joe DeVito, who is a wonderful artist who did my docs when I was writing Doc at Bantam books in the early '90s. That second book is with the big golden hand. That's Empire of Doom, where the Shadow and Doc Savage team up to fight Shiwan Khan, who was believed to be dead, but isn't dead. But maybe he's dead at the end of this book at last. And these are my other Doc Savages. This is the Wild Adventures of Doc Savage. And that's how I started the Wild Adventures series.
I love it.
And they're very popular. I mean, they're still selling. I mean, the first one I did in 1991, but in the most recent incarnation, I started in 2013, and that book is still selling well. So Doc fans are still finding the series, and new Doc fans are still finding this series.
And there you go, folks. And of course, so definitely make a trip over here to purchase some of Will's great works. I'm definitely going to buy a couple of them, especially a couple of these Doc Savage ones. So we're excited about that. And of course, if you want to see his short story in the Thrilling Adventure Yarns,
yes,
I suggest you back it today. Yeah.
Yeah, because we're getting close. Oh, we hit 7,000, so we're getting closer. Okay. Well, let's just hit that 9,000 mark, and my Silver Snail story will see print.
Yeah. In fact, I'm going to contribute to the Kickstarter myself again. I just have to find the time to do it. But yeah. Yeah. So it was great having you on. Please come back anytime you want.
Oh, sure. Thank you. I'd love to, because we barely sketched the story. We never talked about the time I spent on movie sets, except for The Shadow. I've been on Total Recall. I was on the Remo Williams movie, the first Zorro movie, the second Day the Earth Stood Still. For Starlog sent me all over the world to cover films, and it was quite a gig. Quite a gig indeed.
Oh, now you definitely have to come back. We just want to get into those stories.
I got some great stories about being on movie sets.
Okay. Fantastic. Well, folks, I think that's going to be it for us tonight. I'm Ian Miller, and this has been Triple Threat Comics YouTube channel. Have yourselves a great night.
Thanks for having me.
Of course.